Everyone, this is Mike Wilkerson. I am the founder of Stormwall Advisors, the host of Stormwall.com, and the author of Why America Matters. Coming to you today in May 2023, just after the release of April's CPI data, and wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that I don't think CPI matters, that we're seeing increasing evidence to support a suspicion that CPI does not represent the actual inflation that Americans are facing as they struggle with rising prices for everything they use, including education, healthcare, housing, food, energy, you name it. I mean, the felt experience of many consumers is that CPI underestimates the real and rising cost of living. Now, but this is not just an emotional or subjective reaction. It turns out that the private sector data and other data like regulatory filings are also undermining the message and the data provided by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the government entity that manages the CPI. So let's start and take the cost of higher education as an example. The CPI figures from the BLS indicate that inflation in college tuition and fees has been mild at about 2.4% per year since 2013 over the past 10 years. And remarkably, given the general price inflation we've experienced, just above 2.2% per year on average for the past 2 years through March of 2023. Yet, according to data from the National Center for Education Statistics, the average annual cost for a full-time student at a 4-year degree granting institution is up 125% since 2000. Now, this figure includes tuition, board, dormitory costs, etc. But the important point is it translates into 4.1% average annual inflation over 20 years. Public institutions have fared worse on that than average, with costs up 127%. While average annual costs of private institutions are only up 112%. Now, these data go back only until 2021, but more recently, figures from the Brown Center on Educational Policy at Brookings shows that inflation, academic inflation, is running hotter recently at 5.3% through the 2021 academic year and 8.5% in the 2022 academic year. So another example is just the cost of medical care. This illustrates the disconnect, I think, between private sector data and the government's data. So the BLS CPI data for medical care suggests that inflation has been moderate at 2.6% over the past 10 years. And again, this is surprising, just below 2.2% per year on average for the past 2 years through March of 2023. And again, at a period of time when inflation generally was rising much above that. Now, on the other hand, trend analysis from PwC's Health Research Institute shows that since 2006, medical care costs have increased by 220% in total, representing an average annual increase of 7.6%. Now, while this isn't precisely a measure of inflation, in that the PwC analysis measures the percentage increase in the cost to treat a patient from one year to the next, assuming benefits remain the same. In other words, it tracks the increase in cost for the same services year after year, which are rising at 3 times what CPI indicates. So we got education, we got medical care, but also the same story is evident in housing. CPI data indicates that the cost of shelter, as they call it, is up 8.2% for the 12 months through March. That's pretty stiff. Over the past 3 years, shelter is up 15.5% in total since April 2020. And this represents just under 5.1% annually. Now, 5% per year is a lot, but it still substantially underrepresents the private sector analysis of similar housing costs. So, for example, a very well-known index called the S&P Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index reveals that over that period of time, in other words, since April 2020, home prices are up 35% or 11.1% annually. While not completely apples to apples, this is more than double the closest CPI category. Nonetheless, whether 5% or 11% or somewhere in between, median nominal wage growth, while recently increasing to around 6%, has been well below either level for much of the past 3 years. It's important to point out that when housing prices rise substantially faster than income, homes become liabilities rather than assets. And we saw this, of course, in the housing bubble, which led to the global financial crisis some 15 plus years ago. Now, I wrote earlier this year some articles that you can find in the Epic Times or at Stormwall.com describing how CPI was underrepresenting the rising cost of electricity and food in two separate articles. I mean, in these cases, I looked at regulatory applications from regional power companies for double-digit price increases in 2023 and historical same good purchasing data from Amazon Prime, respectively, for electricity and for food. So I'm not going to repeat that here, but the upshot of each analysis was, again, the same. They confirmed that inflation for both energy and groceries is running and continues to run much higher than the CPI data indicate, and of course, higher than the CPI aggregate itself. Now, I wrote at the time that the aggregate CPI figures underrepresented what the American consumer is experiencing in two important and fundamental ways. First, the costs most important to most Americans, namely food, energy, and shelter, have risen much faster than aggregate CPI. Secondly, the CPI figures, which compares one year against the previous, tend to hide the base effects of inflation, which means that if you have compounding of inflation over 2, 3 or more years, the actual total inflation, total price impact is much, much greater, of course, over that period of time. And I wrote that the result of both of these effects was to distort and underestimate the real impact on Americans' shrinking wallets. So now I'm raising a third fundamental issue with the BLS CPI data. CPI is simply not telling the whole story, especially not the one being lived out by struggling working class and middle class households trying to provide for their families. Inflation is and will inflation is and will remain much worse than what the government data indicate. While this isn't great news, I hope it's at least been helpful and interesting to understand what's going on with some of these CPI figures that we've seen today and over the past couple of months. If this has been helpful, please do like it, share this video, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And also sign up for email updates at stormwall.com. We send out videos and articles pretty much every week. You'll want to be the first to know what's going on as we continue to talk about the banking crisis, talk about issues going on with inflation, the employment markets, everything else, including issues around the war in Ukraine, sanctions, etc. So I hope you've enjoyed it. We'll see you next time here on stormwall.com.